Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And today we're going to be looking at some of your lovely voicemails. And our first voicemail is from Ricardo. Take it away.
Hey there, John. Ricardo here. I thought I'd send a message regarding your latest podcast, I guess. I have a suggestion of another 2d6 system, which is actually made for Sword and Sorcery, called Sword of Cepheus, and its younger cousin, Barbaric. Sword of Cepheus itself is made from Cepheus engine, which is like an SRD version of Classic Travelers. So yes, you do have the character creation with all the life paths, and you can actually just die in character creation. That's a small thing, but Barbaric doesn't have this. Although the character generation still includes a lot of different background events that could help you create the world, like your tribal is at war, or you've been kicked out or something of the sort. The games do play, like the main system is similar to Barbarians of Umur, but they have their own twists. Even Barbaric and Sword of Cepheus are pretty different because they deal with different power ranges in a way.
Well, thank you very much for your message. Yeah, I do actually have a copy of Sword of Cepheus, although I've not really looked into it in any great detail. As I was saying in the Sword and Sorcery episode I did, part of my issue with a lot of Sword and Sorcery games is they sort of have a background like baked into the rules of the game. Whereas for me, like certainly with D&D and stuff like that, a big part of the fun for me is coming up with that world in conjunction with the player character, so you get somewhat fine-tuned to your own particular tastes. But maybe I'll give Sword and Cepheus another look, and because I've not heard of this Barbaric, so I might have to give that a bit of a look.
So, something that I've always wondered about with these games with the life path thing.
Yeah.
What's the appeal of going through like 6 characters and only one of them survives to the start of the game?
Well, I think it's a bit of a misnomer, to be perfectly honest. Like, although it's technically possible to like die in character gen when you're doing Traveller, it's not really likely. Now, I can't remember the exact specifics of it, but basically, sort of broadly speaking, at a certain point in Traveller, you can go, oh, that's me done, I'm fine. Or you can basically choose to like keep rolling extra stuff till I get like some extra abilities.
Right, so it's like a gamble.
Yeah, basically, because it's like, to take the example, there's one where you can have done a certain period of like military service in Traveller, and it's like each time you do it, you have a certain amount of time. Like, oh, were you injured? Were you like bounced out of the service? But like beyond a certain point, you have to choose to keep rolling, and it's like, okay, yeah, your character gets a little bit better with each roll, but you also run the risk of dying or sort of like getting bounced out of the service or whatever.
I can see how that might work.
So to me, it's basically like, you can push it, but you push it too far, you get a little bit too greedy, and whop! That's your character done, and you're starting off from the start again.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Anyway, I think our first caller's got a little bit more to say.
No, I've never actually played any of these systems, although I've seen some playthroughs and or actual plays, and they do seem to play pretty well. Dragons Are Real. I don't know the gentleman's name, but episode I think 90 on it's on YouTube. He does a comparison of the 3 games: Barbarians of Lemuria, Sword of Cepheus, and Barbaric. And
yeah, the fellow you're talking about for Dragons Are Real is my old mucker Pete Jones, and in fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, I worked on a, unfortunately, short-lived podcast, Purple Worm, with him and a few others, and very much enjoyed that. I'm a big fan of Dragons Are Real, so I advise you go and check that out. For anyone who's listening, if you've not done so already, they've got a podcast, they're on YouTube, etc. Although I didn't know he'd actually done a Swords and Sorcery comparison, so thanks for bringing that to my attention. I'll definitely give that a listen.
And another one that is super white, but I think that Barbaric is really it's very light, but it's sort of generic, like too generic for long-term play. Although the booklet is just like 50 pages. Sword of Cepheus is around 130, but it has a lot more stuff in it that you can use to flesh out. So you could actually just use Barbaric and then like import stuff directly from Sword of Cepheus, because they're basically compatible with each other. And it's definitely worth the look. I think the book is pretty cheap. Like the PDFs are like $7, something like that. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Again, thanks very much for your call, and I'll definitely have a look at that Barbaric. And like I say, I might delve in a little bit into that Swords of Cepheus, because I've got a copy of that knocking around somewhere. I've recently got my hard copy of the Black Sword Hack, which I mentioned in the episode that I sort of purchased a while ago, and that's a sort of a version of the Black Hack, which is a very simplified form of D&D, but this one's been specifically slanted towards swords and sorcery. And one of the reasons I like that is because it doesn't really have this background hard baked in, so you can do more your own thing with it. It's like, I like Astonishing Swords and Swordsmen of Hyperborea, but again, the background's a big part of that, and I almost feel like I'd be sort of like running like a diet or caffeine-free version of the game if I just scooped all that background out and put a load of my old stuff in. But that's just my opinion.
One last question. Do you think Fate Core or another version of Fate still holds up today as well as it did? Or has something come up that surpasses it in terms of like storytelling and the style of play? Thanks.
So, yeah, I think in terms of Fate, obviously, as I'm sure you're probably aware, I used to play and run a lot of Fate, and I've sort of leaned more heavily towards like the OSR games in recent years, so I've not really been running as much of it. But I still think it stands up today, to be perfectly honest.
See, Fate and D&D do such different things.
Yeah, they scratch
you
different
could
itches.
try and run the same story with the two different systems, with the same player group, playing effectively the same characters, and it would play out very, very differently in the two systems. The D&D one would automatically be a lot more combat oriented, a lot more rules and ticking boxes and getting +1s to this and that with weaponry and things, whereas the Fate one would naturally become more about the storyline and about debating and talking things out. So depending on what your player group is, that's going to help determine which system you're going to run.
Yeah, I think Hannah's absolutely right. Both games, and all of the various other games, they scratch very different itches. Now, for me, I've lent more towards the OSR stuff recently because I'm trying to get into running more like long-term campaigns. And for me personally, Fate and Fate Accelerated and all the various Fate sort of offshoots, they're great for short campaigns. They're great for like one-shots and stuff like that because they're very easy to get into. If you want something a little bit more narrative and you don't mind the sort of narrative mechanics, they're great for that. However, for me, they don't really scratch that like long-term campaign itch, because I love that whole idea. And again, it's just personal preference, but I love that whole idea of like, when you start off, particularly in old school D&D, not so much recent versions, then you start off and you're literally like the sort of level 1 like dung farmer, and then if you survive all these adventures, eventually you're like a big mover and shaker in the land. Whereas when you start off in Fate, you start off as very competent in whatever area you choose to have your character in, and there's nothing wrong with either style of those games. It's down to personal preference. So for me, when I'm running a one-shot or a convention game where I want to just like, we haven't got time for you to build up a big character and whatever, we want to get straight into it, and I want you to be playing like a kick-ass Jedi or a space pirate or a samurai or whatever, straight from the get-go, Fate is brilliant for that. Whereas when I want to run a campaign where it's like that hero's journey going from zero to hero, Fate doesn't really do that for me, which is why I've lent towards the OSR sort of stuff more recently. But I do think Fate stands up pretty well nowadays, to be honest, and obviously there's more books and support material out there for it than there was when it first came out. So I still think it's a pretty good game, but it's good at the thing it does. It's not like a game for everything, which is in the same way, in my opinion, D&D's not a game for everything. It does one thing, it does it pretty well, and that's it. Obviously, you can tweak it, you can rewrite swathes of it to make it work with other things, but there's probably already a game out there that does what you want it to do. So, there you go. But thank you very much for the call in, greatly appreciated.
Hi, this is Lawson, aka one half of Phoenix Golem. It's a game design company me and my friend Alex made. I try to plug it wherever I can. But anyway, I was just looking online for different faction rules for D&D, running factions and against each other and in the background of the player's activity, and I came across your Stars Without Number inspired Streets with Number first draft rules. I really appreciate how simple it is and streamlined. I do really enjoy the Without Number books. However, I found the faction rules in those to be a little too complicated for me. So I was looking for something a little simpler. And I really like, yeah, I like how yours is. I know it's not finished; it's just the first draft, but I was really enjoying it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all. And for those of you who aren't aware, Stars Without Number is a D&D-esque sci-fi game published by Kevin Crawford. And it has this faction system where it's almost like a mini game the GM runs in the background, where you have like factions making moves against other factions and trying to improve their own power base. And it's almost like a little mini game the GM runs between the actual sessions. And it's really useful for determining what's going on in the background. So anytime the players like interact with one of the factions, you sort of know what they've got going on. And it's really great. There's some great online resources to help with that. Like there's an amazing website, which I've recommended a few times, called Sectors Without Number, which lets you draw sector maps and randomly determine sector maps, track the factions and stuff like that. However, it is a fairly involved, like I say, sort of mini game, really, in amongst the other game. And the Streets with Number sort of rules that I wrote were my attempt to sort of simplify that down a bit. Mm-hmm. Now, I only got to like the first draft stage, and I'm afraid I'm glad you enjoyed that. Feel free to run with that and do what you want with it. But I may not get beyond the first draft stage, because after I sort of got to that point, which I did mainly as sort of like an exercise to see if I could do it, I then realised that I'm taking a slightly complicated system and I'm trying to make it simpler, whereas I'd probably be better just starting from scratch and doing something simple rather than starting with something complicated and trying to make it simple. And to be honest, at the moment, I'll see opinions change and my opinions wax and wane, as anyone's do. The most simple system I found for factions, to be perfectly honest, is, I forget where I saw it, but essentially someone was saying what you should do is you should take a handful of dice, you have a dice for each faction, the size of the dice is determined by how powerful the faction is. So like if it was a little weak faction, it's a D4. If it's like a really massive faction, it might be like a D20. You take the dice for all of your factions, roll them onto a board or a piece of paper or whatever, and then you look around for any sort of like ones. And if you get a 1 on that dice, that faction has been up to something. Something has occurred with that faction. Mm-hmm. If it's near to another faction, then whatever's happened has involved that other faction. So if 2 dice are like touching, those 2 factions have been involved with something. And, you can determine whether it's friendly or hostile or whatever. And that just seemed like a really nice, simple system to me. Just pick up a handful of dice, roll them, look at some numbers, interpret what they mean. And obviously you need a bit of like interpretation with that, but I'm definitely leaning more towards simple stuff, because as a GM, you've already got so much going on when you're planning a campaign. For me, the last thing I want is to have to like adjudicate a whole load more points and other stuff to run like a second game that only I'm really playing in the background. Don't get me wrong, the rules work fine in Stars Without Number, and if you love that, crack on with it. All the best to you. But for me, it's a little bit like too intense for what I want from a downtime system, to be perfectly honest. But I'm glad you liked the sort of simplified rules I put up, and like I say, feel free to take those, do what you want with them, with my blessing.
Or just get a handful of dice.
Yeah, or just get a handful of dice, yeah.
Hey, John, this is Randy from Biggest Geekus. I'm in the middle of your Sword and Sorcery game podcast, and I think you did a good job describing all the tropes. I like Points of Light idea, too, in 4E. I didn't like 4E, but I like the Points of Light idea. I also always do what you do, I think. Man, I'm playing, just like you said, I'm playing every other Friday. I could play every Friday. I could do this, and I want to start a second campaign, but luckily I never get to the actual doing it because I think it would burn me out. I don't think I have the energy. I'm an over prepper to the max, so I think one campaign is enough for me, but I do admire people that can do it. So keep on keeping on, brother, and good podcast, man. Take care. Bye.
Cheers, Randy. Much appreciated. And yeah, I quite often, like, 'cause I'm running like a bi-weekly game at the minute, I quite often find myself going, oh, I could fit in a second game on like the alternating Fridays, something a little bit different. But as you rightly say, Randy, like trying to run more than one game, I've done it in the past and it is far easier to get burnt out.
I mean, way back when we were first together and we lived
Back
in a house
in the
with
day.
no internet and no TV for a couple of years, and we went through that phase of like playing 9 games a week.
Yeah, it was a bit intense, wasn't it?
Yeah, it did get a bit much.
Yeah, and I mean, I sort of recognise that now, and like I think if I was going to run 2 games now, they'd have to be sort of fairly low prep games, like like hex crawls or sandbox games, stuff like that.
Well, yeah, because the other thing about doing that is that the game suffers as a result. You don't end up doing any good games. It just sort of becomes a chore.
Yeah, and I think I think you've hit on the exact right thing there, love. That if you're running a couple of games and it gets to the point where sort of prepping for the game and running it feels more like work and like a job than something you actually enjoy, that's when I sort of start going off. Because I mean, as we all know, running a game is like a fair investment of time. Even when you're not sat down writing stuff, you've got to think it, you're always mulling stuff over in your head. And if it starts feeling like a second day job, rather than something you enjoy, I mean, let's face it, most of us aren't getting paid for running games. I mean, we put up with the drudgeries of our day-to-day job because we get that money at the end of the month or however often you get paid.
And then we go and spend it on RPG books.
Exactly, yeah, because the RPG books are life, as we all know. But yeah, when it starts getting work, then I start sort of losing interest and becoming disenchanted. And once you're in that sort of rut, it's very difficult to get yourself out of it without, as I've done in the past, taking like a break, and you have to leave off running any games for a bit until you sort of get your mojo back and you start running games again. So I think, although I might be tempted to try a second campaign at some point in the future, it would only be if it was like a low prep, low maintenance game, which is one of the reasons I was looking at like an episodic sword and sorcery game, because it'd just effectively be like each week, like, here's an adventure, go. You do that adventure, here's another adventure, go. Like a standard sword and sorcery thing. Like when you read a Conan story, he always starts off, he's got no money, he's spent all of his money, he's like scrubbing around somewhere, like the adventure hook turns up, he goes and does it. Then next time you catch up with him again, he spent all his money, he's grubbing around, rinse and repeat. So I think that sort of game I could run, but I definitely couldn't run a big sort of detailed second campaign. But we'll see, I mean, it's time dependent. I mean, we're struggling to keep up with the podcasts and YouTube at the minute because of like real life and work and stuff like that. So I think realistically, it's not feasible for me at the moment. And I'm really enjoying running my Smoke and Snow campaign, and I'm enjoying playing in Johannes's Burning Wheel game and the sort of drop in, drop out Old School Essentials game I play in that Gavin Norman's running. But I think I would be straining myself if I was trying to do a bit more, and I'd hate for the game I'm running at the minute or the games I'm enjoying playing in to suffer because I was trying to cram another game into my schedule.
Hey, John, this is Randy again. Had to leave you a second message as I finished up your last podcast on sword and sorcery games. 13th Age, fun game. Played that for several years. I think it's really good. It's a little new and indie, a lot of indie mechanics. I'm sure you've read it. I don't know. I guess you could rejigger it to fit a sword and sorcery game. It's pretty high-powered magic. It's got a little, as you said, a little mixture of 4E and 3E. Kind of they met together and had a baby. This will be 13th Age with some cool relationship dice thrown in. Super fun game. It's something we run at our Cabin Con every year. We have an ongoing campaign at our yearly event. You probably heard us talk about it on the podcast, but I say thumbs up to the game. But I would say I'd like to know how it goes if you run it with sword and sorcery. Anyway, keep us posted on how that turns out, man. Take care. Bye.
Thanks again, Randy. Yeah, I've read through my 13th Age books like as a possibility as one game I might like to use. I think having read them that it'd probably take a fair old amount of effort and work to convert it to like work with a swords and sorcery game. And as we were saying earlier when we were talking about downtime systems, it seems a bit strange to me to start off with a system that would need so much work to make it Swords and Sorcery when there's numerous Swords and Sorcery games out there like Barbarians of Lemuria, Black Sword, Hack, stuff like that, that would need far less tweaking to make into the sort of game that I want to run. So I think I'm probably not going to use 13th Age. I'm probably going to look for something amongst my ever-growing pile of books that is closer to what I want, and then just needs a little bit of tweaking, rather than sort of doing the massive amount of work, as far as I'm concerned, that I would need to make 13th Age work as a Swords and Sorcery game. So that's it for this voicemail episode. Thank you to all our wonderful callers. Very much appreciated. Again, as we said earlier, sorry it's taken us so long to get around to these voicemails. Like I say, real life and work have been kicking our arse a bit recently. But we managed to put out an episode earlier on today about the Mari Lwyd, a sort of Welsh folk custom, and how you might use that in your D&D game. So check that out if you haven't already. And we're hoping, and we keep saying this, but we are genuinely hoping that in the new year, when things settle down a little bit, we can get back into a slightly more regular schedule of releasing episodes. So thank you very much again. Hopefully all of you out there have a great Christmas. And remember, whatever game you're playing, whoever you're playing it with, the main point of it is to have fun. Take care.
Bye.